Derek, Gary. One of the buzzwords that keeps coming up in Christian circles is church planting. There are church planting networks sprouting up all over the world. What do you think about this phenomenon? Do you think church planting is the hope of the church?
Yeah, well, every church in Australia and in every single part of the world at one time was a church plant. Every single church. While there are other ways in which to reach people, church planting, we have found, is the most effective way to reach the unreached. New churches reach new people, we've found. So it's not a silver bullet, it's not the only thing you do, but I think I'd argue it is one of the most effective ways to reach people who don't know Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I had a really interesting conversation with a friend the other day, and he was pretty critical about this whole church planting movement. He was saying, we've got limited resources. Why don't we focus on church revitalization? Like, shouldn't that be our focus rather than church planting? Like, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah. Yes and no. It's not both and. I mean, it's what Derek was saying. Every church starts as a church plant. Now, no, I don't think anyone would suggest that we just have church plants and then after 5 years, when they've actually become a church, we shut them down and do another church plant. So inevitably, we do need to invest time and energy in revitalizing. But I've been involved in both. Revitalization is hard work. It takes a long time. And I think the issue with revitalization is that it, especially in the early phases, it's an internal exercise that often you're trying to reach people with the gospel who are already engaged in church. They just may not actually be Christian, or they may not be living a kind of gospel-shaped life. So there's a sense in which while you're revitalizing, gospel progress tends to slow down. So in that sense, it's very time and energy intensive, particularly in terms of leadership and the emotional, spiritual cost that there is in that. Whereas church plants actually at the beginning are relatively low cost, relatively agile. There does come a point where you have to invest in plant, or you're continuing to pour money into renting facilities and so on. And as the church grows, it does become quite costly. But my sense is that it's actually very efficient and very cheap to get a church up and running at the beginning. You've got more experience.
There are things you need to do in order to help a church move towards sustainability up front, and that can cost a reasonable amount of money. You want to have the right people planning churches and having an idea of how they reach it. So assessment of church planters for a particular area, that can be costly, but it's not exorbitant. You can plant in a reasonably agile way, as you said, and doesn't have to cost a huge amount of money, although depending on where you plant, obviously real estate and equipment and rent can cost a lot of money. Church plants can be more agile. It can't be an either or. It has to be a both and. Right. But not everyone who can church plant could revitalise a church, and not everyone who is good at revitalising church could church plant. And so you don't want to chuck young people into a revitalisation where it will kill them. And too often I think I see that young people with energy chucked into church that kills them. It takes much more energy and expertise to turn around a church that is dying than it does to start a church from scratch. Different expertise over here, but we need to do both. And the point at which we say, no, let's do this and not that one, is the point of where we're not pushing all the buttons we need to push. And when we're not pushing all the buttons, if we're pulling all the levers, however you want to see it, the people who inevitably it impacts are the people who are not in church, the people who do not know Jesus. Yep. So that's what we need to keep in front of us. What do we need to do in order to, both in the short term, medium term, and long term, hit the people and reach the people who don't know Jesus?
Yeah. So in short, I mean, I don't think it's an either or. It's both and, revitalization and church planting, and there are key, obviously, advantages, like you said, to church planting. And I mean, I was looking at the stats. It's not like Australia is saturated with churches. Like 50% of Australians are non-Christian, and something like less than 30% go to church every week. So clearly there's a lot more room to grow. More churches could grow in Australia as well.
Particularly in the city. But I was just wondering, Derek, if you've done any thinking. I mean, in terms of a lot of regional communities in Australia, which are often much more static, and there are churches there already, does the balance between the kind of effectiveness of a church plant over against revitalization, is that affected at all in regional centres? You know, is it harder to plant a church in a settled community where people, you know, already have some connection with long-established churches? Is it harder or easier to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, look, you certainly got more credibility if you go in a country town, if you go into a Presbyterian church and you're the Presbyterian minister. Because, you know, you're the guy. People come to you, you have funerals there, people come to your church to be married. So you have an automatic credibility at some level with the community itself. And so that can be very, very hard. It's where church plants, you're right, can be seen as outsiders coming in. And so it might take longer to connect with people. So I suppose, again, it does depend on the context. If you go into an existing church in a country town, where they will battle everything you do, it may not be effective to take that route. You may be better to be the outsider for a while and work your way in, and you'll see more fruit from that from a church plant. But yeah, that's both and thing, isn't it? It's working out what in this context will get to where we need to be, which is people hearing about Jesus and coming to know him. So.
So in short, I mean, the end goal is we want more people to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, and there are clear advantages to church planting. And I guess figuring out whether that's best for you it's context dependent, but it's good to know what the advantages are for church planting.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that it's important that we do it together, at least in conversation with other kind of like-minded people, other people, you know, with a heart for the gospel. You know, because as you say, you know, half of Australia needs to be reached for Christ, and I think we can do that better by talking together, praying together, and recognizing there are also some communities that some of us as individuals or some of us as groups are better placed to reach than others. And I think the more conversations we can have around that, the more positive it will be in the long term for the work of the kingdom in Australia.
Yeah. So yeah, and I'd absolutely echo that. We need to be working out how we build God's kingdom and not just our kingdom. There's no threat with a church plant on the other side of the country, but where it seems to be when they plant next to us, that's when we start to get a little bit. So we need to see the fact that those statistics you said before, you know, the reality is 85% of people in Australia will never walk through the doors of a church. A lot of them don't know Jesus. A lot of them don't know someone who does know Jesus. So it's not as if there aren't enough lost people out there. We need to have a God's kingdom mindset.
Thanks.
Thanks.